So the SHRM Foundation, which is a nonprofit foundation that actually funds research, funded research at 5 universities to say, and we said, here's the model, here's the assessment. We want you to go out and independently assess whether or not this model is working. Because we didn't want anybody to say, well, SHRM, you created the model, you tested the model, and of course, the model works. We wanted to be able to go out and say, yes, the model works, and other people can prove that as well. So these 5 universities got research grants, and they are collecting their own data. We don't have all of this data back yet, but again, it's not just US focused as well. So 5 universities. So here's what it looks like. I've kind of been going a little fast to kind of get to the punchline here. This is the model, and we call it SHRM's Elements for Success. The model has 9 competencies in it. And the 9 competencies, and what you can see is the first one, HR expertise. And you'd think to yourself, well, wouldn't the competency model have mostly HR? No, actually, HR is really just the cost of entry. That's the foundation, that's the baseline. We all have to have HR expertise, compensation, training and development, legislation where you are, employee relations, all of the things that you do on a day-to-day basis that makes your job both fun and difficult. But the other competencies, the other behavioral competencies are these 8. Relationship management, and it looks like it's cut off there. Consultation, leadership and navigation, communication, diversity and inclusion, ethical practice, critical evaluation, and business acumen. The next 9 slides go into detail on all of those. I'm not going to go into that detail. But what I will also say is that in addition to this, this is about a 40-page booklet. And it's available from SHRM. All you've got to do, and I've got information in here, just write to us and we'll send this to you. It's the details. It's the details that say, all right, and by the way, what's interesting about this is we said, well, what's different about HR at the entry level, the mid-level, the senior level, and in the executive level? Are there differences? And of course, you would expect that there are. If you're a person who's starting out in HR, you're relatively new, you need to have all of these things, but you're probably focusing more on the HR technical expertise than you are on navigation, organizational navigation, leadership. You're going to be developing those skills as you go through your career and you advance through your career. So there's a lot of detail behind all this, and many, many behaviors. What the competency model does that's different than just says, well, here's what you have to do. It actually talks about it in terms of behaviors. This is what the behavior looks like. So if you're an executive in the organization, not an HR executive, you need to know, well, what should I be expecting from my HR professionals? What should I look for when I hire somebody in HR? So this is the actual competency model. And as I said, entry level, mid-level, senior, and executive. And we've defined these because if you think about it, an entry level in a small organization might be different than a large organization. It's not just years, it's also what is it that the individual is doing. And the same thing at mid and senior. You could be in HR for 20 years, but if you haven't, because of your own choice or not, moved up in the organization, it could be that you've been there for a long time, but you haven't been doing more senior level things. And again, that's a career choice, that's a perspective that you might take. So flashing through these at blinding speed is HR expertise, and it's got a list of, those are all the sub-competencies, and then sample behaviors. And then this booklet that you can have access to has got just much more detail at each of those levels. Relationship management, some of the things that it covers, and think about it. I mean, these are all things that you do all the time, not just people management, but advocacy and responsiveness to your clients internally in the organization, consultation. You're always doing consultation because a manager may say, we need to hire somebody, and you're probably going to say, okay, so what do you need to hire for? You've got to have actually a discussion sometimes with the hiring manager and with other professionals in the organization. Leadership and navigation, again, political savvy, project management, the focus of being mission-driven in your organization. Communication, diversity and inclusion, ethical practice. And by the way, diversity and inclusion, we started off calling that cultural awareness, global cultural awareness, and we changed the name to diversity and inclusion. And really, it's kind of interesting. We're not sure. We may end up changing the name back to global at some point because, again, through the research, it was sort of back and forth what people wanted to call that particular competency. But I'll just go back to that for 1 second. It has to do with not only having a global perspective, but being culturally aware of your workforce, as well as thinking about ambiguity, adaptability, and so forth. And there are a lot of different behaviors that go along with that. So critical evaluation, and then the final one, of course, is business acumen, which is, as HR professionals, we exist within a business. How much do you know your business? How able are you to discuss that business? Because understanding the business makes a difference in how you practice HR. And those of you who have moved from industry to industry know that a lot of your HR technical expertise is certainly transferable from one organization to the next, but the ability to have business acumen relative to your business, not just global issues about finance and things of that nature, but being able to learn the business that you're in and understand the pressures with regard to the labor market, whether or not it's seasonal, that sort of thing. So again, flowing through this very quickly at a high level to get to this point. So the self-assessment that we designed to go along with the criterion validation that we did, and it actually, I took it, and I have to say, it took a long time to go through it. It was about a 2 or 3 hour assessment. Usually I go through assessments and I'm, ho-hum, kind of, gosh, why am I doing this? It's a little bit boring. This was so engaging. I mean, I have to say, I didn't design it. I wasn't on the team that did that. We actually hired an industrial psychology consulting firm to help us design this. It was absolutely fascinating because you got to watch these situational the videos and watch what the individual was doing, and then you got to ask a series of questions. And what I found in playing with it, that if I didn't ask the right questions, I didn't get the right information. And so again, the assessment is something that, because it's interactive, it really gets to look at how are you as an HR professional answering these questions. Are you thinking about it the right way? Have you analyzed the information that you have to the point where you know what questions to ask? So the assessment tool, and this, we use this actually to do the situational, the self-assessment for the criterion validation. We're in the process now of doing a whole suite of assessments that are, first one's going to be out at the end of this month, and we're doing, it's called an HR effectiveness survey. And this survey is something that actually helps to evaluate the whole function of HR inside the organization. And then onto self-assessments, and then onto a 180 and a 360, so that you can, depending upon what you're interested in, you could be interested in this from a personal perspective. I want to find out, where am I, how am I doing? If you are a very senior individual in a mid or larger size organization and you have a team of HR professionals, you can approach this and say, well, what do my customers think of my HR function? Are we being effective in the organization? And I don't know about you, but as I talk to my friends who are not HR professionals, I always hear them talking about HR did it again, benefits this, or something of that. And they're either very happy with HR or not so happy with HR. And the HR effectiveness survey allows you to go into your organization and find out, what do your clients think about you? Are they telling you everything that you need to know? They may be giving you feedback about how helpful you are because of a hire that you're doing or helping them with, or not. So this effectiveness survey allows you to go in and say, so what's my feedback? And then the 180 and the 360 allows you to say, not only can I evaluate myself from a self-assessment perspective, but I can also find out, what does the supervisor think? Because if I think I'm particularly good at organizational navigation, but my supervisor does not think I'm particularly good at organizational navigation, there's a disconnect, and you need to know that in order to be effective. The other thing that we're working on, which we hope to have finished by the end of the year, is a behavioral interview guide. So let's say I'm the president of a company or of a division, and my HR person has unfortunately left the organization, and I need to hire a new one. How do I know what questions to ask to determine whether or not I'm going to have somebody who's going to behave in a way that's going to be effective for HR? And so again, using HR professionals for input, focus groups, developing scenarios, we're developing a set of questions that can be used for selection, that will help people with selection. And I can't say how much the law is interactive here, but in the United States, we have many, many laws and legislations about what you can ask and what you can't ask in an employment setting. So because this has been developed in a research fashion and developed for behavioral purposes, we think that organizations are going to be able to use it and find it effective without having to say, now, what questions should I ask? And will I be getting the answers? What answers should I even be looking for in terms of what's going to happen with that individual? So what does all of this mean for your career in HR? Some of you are, I'm looking around the room and I'm guessing that you're more senior to executive level folks. So how do you personally address some of these challenges within your own career? So here's my suggestion. When you get these slides, the detail of the slides, read through those. And again, request this from us. Be happy to send it to you. Assess where you are in your career. Sit down with a piece of paper one day or your iPad and say, okay, on this competency, looking through these behaviors, do I do this? Do I not do this? What are some of the examples that I see my colleagues doing? If you have HR professionals that report to you, think about it in the context of each one of those individuals. Make these 9 competencies a priority in your own development. When you think about coming to seminars like this and other kinds of seminars, what are the things that you need to do? Do you need to go take a finance class, for example? And you may say the answer to that is yes. But demand these competencies in the people that you see, not just in your organization, but in the profession. Part of the reason why SHRM has invested, and we've spent years literally investing in all of this research, is that we're saying, we don't want just individuals to be better at HR. We want the HR profession to be seen as being better. I mean, this is an evolution for HR. HR today, I think, and I would assume it's correct here, and from talking to folks, it is seen as more strategic. It still has a ways to go, and that's certainly true in the US as well. So if you demand these competencies in yourself and in others, we will continue to see an evolution in HR where we are continuing to advance in terms of being seen as strategic and being partners in the organization. We have some more information on our website, but also, as I mentioned, this is where you'll be able to go. Just send an email. And one of the things that we're doing, and don't be surprised if you get this question, is we ask people, so how are you going to use this? Because we want to be careful that you're going to use this for your own individual development as opposed to, and again, I don't think any of you will certainly do this, but run out and develop your own training course and then offer it to other people. So we do have to be a little bit careful on that regard. So again, that's the elements for success. It's, we think it's a pretty cool model. We had a couple of different sort of pictures and configurations along the way. What this says is that none of these are more important than the other. They're all very important, and they all work together and interact together. Excuse me. So where do we go next? For the last 20 minutes, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about HR standards. So what's the connection between competencies, your own personal competencies, and HR standards? We've been asked this question a lot. There are certifications that you can get, many different certifications. In HR, I have SPHR, Senior Professional in Human Resources. You can become certified in benefits or in compensation. You can become certified in project management. Lots of certifications. And as you know, certifications are really becoming much bigger. A lot of folks are getting them today. Certifications test individuals on their knowledge of a body of knowledge. So if you take a test and you're able to pass it, it means you know that body of knowledge. You know the information, or at the very least, you've been able to study that information and pass the test. So here I am, an SPHR. Does that mean that I could go out and do what you do? Could I be an effective HR professional? Honestly, I don't think so. Because the last time I was an HR professional was 30 years ago. I was a training manager at a savings and loan company. I did that before I went back to graduate school. But could I be the head of an HR organization? Honestly, I don't, I know enough to pass the test, but day to day, I haven't done that in 30 years. And so, great, I'm glad I'm certified. I think it's important, and it shows that I know this body of knowledge. But I'm not sure that I'm competent in HR to do what you all do on a day-to-day basis. But that's what certification does. And the competency model provides this overarching framework that says it's not just what you know, but it's also the other areas that you have to be able to be competent in to be successful in your job. So the first two are very individually focused. HR standards are generally accepted practices. And they focus on the profession and on the function of HR, not on the individual. So that's the distinction. Competencies have to do with the individual, whereas the standards that I'm going to talk about have to do with the function. So what are HR standards? A standard, it's an agreed upon way of doing something. It's distilled wisdom. It's talking to people and finding out how do you do things. It's essentially a consensus-driven process, and it's also voluntary. So you may have heard of ISO, International Standards Organization. In the United States, we have a group called ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute. Here in Denmark, you have Danish standards. And I have to tell you, I went out yesterday and I actually met with the folks at Danish Standards. I was interested in meeting with them, and since I knew I was coming here, I reached out and was able to get a meeting, which I'll tell you about in a moment. So there are individual country standards organizations, and then there's ISO. So the creation of standards, from my perspective, really helps confirm HR as a profession. We all know what we do as a profession. We believe that. But frankly, certainly in academic circles, and if you read some of the popular press, magazine articles, there are folks who say HR isn't a profession. And after 30 plus years in the profession, I kind of disagree. I think it is, and I think anything that we can do to help ourselves evolve and to show ourselves as a profession is going to be something that's good. So standards aren't meant to be public policy. They're not meant to say this is a regulation, this is what you have to do. Standards are meant to create consistency across organizations. It's meant to provide guidelines to people who they can use them in their own organization or across multiple locations if you happen to have that luxury. So, and also if you think about it, it can improve the HR organizational performance. But of course that implies that they have to be understood and applied correctly. So that's what standards are. How can you use standards once they're created? They're voluntary, but unless you actually use them and implement them in the organization, they're probably not going to be helpful to you. And I'm going to give you some examples in a moment. It can help you sell things in your organization. So one of the things we've done in the United States is we have, and standards, by the way, can be done at the national level and at the international level. And just because you do standards internationally, it doesn't mean you have to do them nationally. So here in Denmark, you may be very, and I hope you are, interested in getting involved in creating international standards, but you may not see a need to create national standards. In the US, we've definitely seen that need. So we have created standards. We've got a standard on performance management. And by the way, this is also available on our website. Just go take a look, and it's free. It's a nice, extensive report, and you can certainly download that. It talks about performance management, about here's what performance management is, and here's the standard around why you should do it and how you should do it. It should be goal setting and so forth. You can take that information, and you can build an argument for the CEO of your organization to say, here's why we should do performance management. Do all of you do performance management in your organizations? Anybody doesn't do performance management? That's actually great. Frankly, in the US, I would say that at least a third of the room would say, no, we don't do performance management. So again, one of the reasons for doing that. Cost per hire. How much does it cost you to hire somebody? This is a very specific calculation. And what we found is that organizations were saying, well, this is how I calculate cost per hire, but if I were to go at lunchtime and talk to the person next to me at a gathering like this, and I'd say, so how much do you spend on hiring somebody? What's your cost? And somebody might say, well, it's $3,000. I don't know what that would translate into to kroner, but I'll say $3,000. And this person says, no, we spend $4,000. Well, the number is not a number to necessarily beat. You want to spend more or you want to spend less. But what are the components? How do you plan for that? How do you budget for how much you're going to spend? What do you need for your recruitment budget? You have to think about turnover. You have to think about where and how you advertise. You have to think about training costs. There are a lot of things that you need to think about. And if you're in a particular industry or in a particular geographic location, wouldn't it be helpful if you knew that this organization over here, perhaps inside your own organization or this division, is spending X amount of money to recruit somebody compared to this one? Well, what are the differences? Is the turnover the same in both instances? Because if the turnover is a lot lower in one instance than it is in another, then you might want to think of what the components that go into that. So It can help you sell something, and it can help you argue for creating a program or an initiative in your organization. It can also help you analyze and understand problems in your organization. So that's how you use standards once they're created. The journey. Now, the journey started for me well over 10 years ago, and as was mentioned, I've been working at SHRM now almost 14 years, and shortly after I came in there, I had a couple of objectives that I wanted to do. One was a competency model, which I'm pleased to say we're working on, and one was standards, and we started to think about this. In the US, we have something called Generally Accepted Accounting Practices, GAAP, and it's financial reporting, and everybody who is in the finance and accounting area knows about GAAP. And we started to think about this and said, well, is there something that you might call GARP, Generally Accepted Human Resource Practices? And we kicked the idea around a little bit and tried to figure out what it was all about. And in 2008, we actually hired somebody to develop this whole program in standards. Now, the initial focus was in the US, and it was focused on national standards. And that's where those two that I just showed you came from, performance management and cost per hire. And in fact, the first standards task forces were established in 2009. And we've got 3 standards right now, and we've got about 7 or 8 that are actually in progress, and I'll show you that in a second. In 2010, though, we said, what about standards internationally? Is there a place for this internationally? We work with ANSI, and ANSI is a member of ISO, very active member of ISO. And so ANSI worked with us to create this proposal and proposed it to ISO. And in fact, in 2011, the US was voted by ISO to be the secretariat to what is called TC 260. TC is a technical committee, and everything that ISO does has either a technical committee or a program committee. And TC 260 is now established as the place for creating international standards. And the first meeting was just in 2011 and occurred in Washington, D.C. When I was here back in 2012, the second plenary meeting had not yet even taken place. So you don't need to know about ANSI. As I mentioned, this is what it looks like in the US, and what you can see, I don't know if you can see that it's bolded, but performance management essentially was finished because we finished that standard. By the way, when a standard is created, it doesn't just go on a shelf and say, okay, here it is. About every 3 to 5 years, that standard is reevaluated. Has anything changed? Do you need to update it in some way? Do we have more information? Have we found that something through case studies has worked or hasn't worked? We've got the workforce violence. We actually did that, the first one. We partnered with another association that was a standard-setting organization. And frankly, although workplace violence is an important issue, it wasn't necessarily the very first issue you think about with regard to human resources. But for us, it was a way to learn how to do standards from somebody who's already been doing it. So that was a great opportunity for us. In addition to the cost per hire, we've got workforce planning as a very active discussion right now. We've got diversity and inclusion. We've got 3 different sets of standards that we're working on right now. So this is, and by the way, all of this work, it's done by volunteers and it's done virtually. So we probably have somewhere between 400 and 500 professionals in the US. You don't have to be a member of SHRM, and in fact, you don't have to live in the US. Anybody can participate in these. And we have phone calls in which we discuss what the parameters are, and then we have little subgroups that go off and work together, again, usually virtually, and create drafts, and this is part of the reason why it takes a long time to create a standard, but it's consensus-driven because once the group has come up with, here's what we think the standard is going to look like in performance management, it then gets discussed by the larger group, full task force, and then it goes out to all of the people that are involved in that, and then it ultimately goes out to a public review. Meaning that you put out press releases and say, here's a standard that we think will be good for the profession. Anybody can comment on that. Anybody who is a user of performance appraisals, a recipient of performance appraisals, or HR professionals, consultants, practitioners, academics. And again, then the whole group votes on it, and it either becomes a standard or it doesn't become a standard. But you have to include all of the feedback from people. So that's what it looks like in the US. We've talked about ISO. TCs, I already mentioned that. Here's something that's important, and this is the reason why I went to see the folks at Danish Standards yesterday. When ISO creates a technical committee, countries then join that either as a participant or as an observer. A participating country is a country that establishes what is called a mirror committee. So in the US, we have something called the US TAG, which is the Technical Advisory Group. We have about 30 members of that TAG right now, and they are HR professionals from companies, from universities, individual consultants. And these folks are the ones who work on international standards. Every country who is a participating country has to have what's called a mirror committee, which is essentially that advisory group that works on the standards internationally. Every country at the TC who's a participant gets a vote. So what I mentioned before at the national level, same thing happens internationally. If you create a standard on performance management, all the countries that are participating in that will review it, and then it ultimately goes to the country for the vote. In the country, there'll be a vote, and then that country's vote will go to ISO. So again, consensus-driven process. So Danish Standards is a participating country in ISO TC 260. Danish Standards does not have a mirror committee. So one of the questions is, well, gosh, could there be a mirror committee? And in fact, they're very interested in establishing a mirror committee. So what I have here up front is I actually brought some business cards of the woman from Standards, and she would love to hear from you. She would love to create a mirror committee of people who are interested in participating in international standards. So that's one opportunity for all of you. So what's the progress, and where are we? Where are we going with all of this? I mentioned that the second plenary meeting took place in Melbourne, Australia. Why Melbourne, Australia? Well, first of all, the technical committee is going to shift around from nation to nation over time because, again, you want this to be inclusive. And how easy or difficult is it for people to travel to that? There's something called the World Federation of Personnel Management Associations, WFPMA. WFPMA is essentially a federation of HR associations. So here in Europe, there's the European Association of Personnel Associations. There's the North American Association. There's a Latin American Federation. All of those groups belong to, certainly if they choose, to World Federation. And every other year, the World Federation has a meeting someplace around the world. They usually do it in conjunction with a particular country's annual conference. It happened to be in Melbourne in 2012. We had 10 countries participate. One of the active countries in standards is Australia. ARI is the HR association, and then there's also the Australian Standards Association. Last year, we held the plenary meeting in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. There was no World Federation meeting, but the Netherlands has been very active in TC 260, so we held the meeting there. We're hoping that the meeting is going to take place this October in Santiago, Chile. The reason why we don't know yet is because that's where the World Federation meeting is. And in order for us to have that meeting, we have to work with the Standards Association of Chile. Chile has not yet joined the standards effort for TC 260. So we're working on that. Again, this is all kind of a work in progress. So what does all this mean for you in this room? Since we started this effort back in 2011, we now have what's called 5 work groups on international HR standards. The 5 work groups are, one is on terminology, metrics, human governance, workforce planning, and recruitment. So going back to the beginning, terminology is each of these work groups is led by a particular country, and then many countries participate in that. Why terminology? We started with terminology because, let's face it, when you say workforce planning, does that mean the same thing to you in Denmark as it does to somebody in Australia or somebody in China or somebody in India? It may or may not. And if your organization is a multinational organization and you have the need to talk with your counterparts in other parts of the world, then there needs to be a common terminology. So that's the reason for one of those. Metrics. You know, one of the things that HR today is called upon to do much more of is to be very data-focused, very analytically focused, and to look at metrics. How do we measure things in organizations? So that's led by the United States, and in fact, the cost per hire, we're considering this not as a standard, but as what's called a technical specification. And part of the reason for that, it was actually an interesting conversation that we had when we were in Australia. Folks said, well, how can you do cost per hire without also considering quality of hire? Because the two go hand in hand. And that certainly is true. You want to look at quality of hire as well as cost per hire. But those are the kinds of conversations that the HR professionals have. The human governance, this is being led by France. And by the way, you can see that there are experts from the different countries. Not every country participates in every conversation. But what you'll see is a theme here. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, the Netherlands. What we want, our ultimate goal with standards, is to create an increased participation from HR professionals from across the entire world so that we have truly consensus-driven standards. France has been leading the human governance one. It's really more about who should participate. Should there be representation on the board of directors from HR, for example, in a company? You know, that's an interesting debate in and of itself. These other two, these two were just added at the last plenary meeting in Rotterdam. One is workforce planning. Australia, interestingly enough, I don't know if it's come out yet, but they were working on a standard for the country that's almost out. The US has been working on a standard. We haven't come to consensus yet because it's kind of a big topic. And then recruitment, which is, so what is that really, what are we looking at? And these are the broad topics. There might be more specific slices that come out as actual standards. I'm going to run out of time. So these are the participating countries. And again, you can see that Denmark is there. I encourage all of you to get involved in some way. All of the conversations almost happen virtually. What's interesting about this is actually next month in Paris, the 5 working groups are actually meeting for 1 day each. A company has volunteered space. And some, not all, representatives are going to be going to having face-to-face conversations. So you try to do that whenever possible, but you can participate without committing to having to actually physically be there. You can do a WebEx conversation with that as well. And a lot of it's done through email. These are observing countries. Observing countries don't have to have a mirror committee, but they also don't get a vote. But they can participate as equally and freely in the conversations. It's just a worldwide map. The biggest problem we have is we have representation. You can see a lot in Europe, also some in China, a little bit in Africa, nothing yet in South America. And so, in fact, I've had some conversations this year with the folks in Brazil as well as with Chile because we really want to have representation from across the entire world so that the standards are representative. We have liaison members. I mentioned the European Association of Work and Organizational Psychologists. That group is a liaison. You may be familiar with quality standards, ISO 9000. That technical committee is a liaison to our committee because we think there's they think there's a relationship between them and us. So what are the continuing efforts? We're going to continue as an organization, SHRM is, to work on all of this, to help convene and to help sort of spread the word. You can visit our website. There's a little bit more information on there. I really encourage your participation in all of this. I think standards for the profession will help us overall. And you know, call me crazy, but it's fun. It's interesting. So here's a little bit of information about Danish standards. I put their website there. You can certainly go and take a look at it. And again, I have some of their cards up here. And so here's the question that I pose to you, and that is, should there be Danish standards nationally? And the answer to that may be yes, and it may be no. Even if the answer is no and you don't create a structure, should there be participation from the HR community to a worldwide effort? And I would hope the answer to that is yes. So again, the logos. Everybody thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing themselves except those of us in HR. We in HR do that. We are changing the world. We are changing ourselves. We are evolving ourselves as HR professionals, and we're evolving the profession. Thank you very much, and I'll be around all day.